Keeping Safe and Hygienic Revisited. Personal hygiene. So today we'll be able to define what personal hygiene is and understand how food can become unsafe. You should be able to identify cross-contamination risks and preventative measures, and recognise the importance of food safety and explain important preventative measures for keeping food safe. So food poisonings in the news. When a big outbreak happens, it hits the newspapers. People can lose their livelihood with it. People can be jailed with it if it's very serious. How does contamination happen? Food contaminants are things that are in the food that should not be there. So that's how you remember what contaminant is. Things that are in the food that should not be there. So a contaminant can come from a variety of places. It can come from animals. It can come from the meat and the fish. It can come from the air, the contaminated water or dirt on the environment. It's in the soil. That's why we wash our vegetables. And can also be a deliberate act from people, or it could be accidental. So people contaminate food if they don't wash their hands after using the toilet, or if they're in contact with somebody who's sick, or they sneeze or vomit onto the food or onto food contact surfaces, or they touch dirty food contact surfaces and equipment and then touch the food. So that's how people can contaminate food. Foodborne illnesses such as food poisoning can happen if unsafe food is the result of contamination. And the contamination can happen either from a biological source, a chemical source, or a physical source. So the biological hazards, they could be bacteria, viruses, parasites, or fungus. Remember that's one of your questions on your worksheets. So biological hazards are the four things: bacteria, viruses, parasites, and fungi. Fungi are like mushrooms. To be able to prevent bacteria multiplying, you need to understand how they grow. So they need food, usually proteins. They need a little bit of acidity. They need a warm temperature, they need time, and they need air, and they need moisture. If you take away any of those, you can help prevent the bacteria growing. But the main ones that you can control is temperature and time. So we keep high-risk foods that support bacterial growth, out of the danger zone being the temperature range of 5 degrees to 63 degrees. Sometimes you have to have the food in the danger zone during the cookery process, but if you can control the danger zone while the food is ready or while you're hot holding it, and sometimes prior to preparing the food, then you're well on your way to controlling the bacterial growth. Time, if you can limit how long the high-risk foods that support the growth of bacteria, spend in the danger zone temperature range, then also you'll be able to control bacterial growth. Viruses, they're carried by human beings and animals, and they require a living host to grow. They don't require food. So they don't grow on food, but they can be transferred through the food and remain infectious in the food. And the sources of viruses are typically food, water, or any contaminated surface, and they typically occur through the fecal-oral route, i.e. not washing your hands after the toilet. To control it, you can't destroy viruses through the normal cooking temperatures. Good personal hygiene has to be practiced when handling food and food contact surfaces, and then a quick removal and thorough clean-up of vomit is important. Parasites, they require a living host to reproduce, and they can be found in seafood, wild game, venison, and others, and food processed with contaminated water. And the way to prevent that is purchase food from an approved supplier, a reputable one, cook food to the required and minimum internal temperatures, that's the core temperature, and fish that should be served raw or undercooked must be frozen correctly by the manufacturer to kill off any parasites. Fungi are yeasts, moulds and mushrooms, and some moulds and mushrooms produce a toxin. A toxin is a poison, so you need to throw out mouldy food unless the mould is a natural part of the food. So things like blue cheese, the mould is injected into the cheese. You need to purchase mushrooms from approved and reputable suppliers. Then we have chemical contaminants. Chemical hazards are cleaners, sanitizers and polish. And you can see from the picture, somebody's using a sanitizer and I think they may have sprayed it on the food. They've got so close. So the sources of the chemical contaminants are cleaners, sanitizers, polishes, machine lubricants and pesticides. There's also certain kitchen equipment made from pewter, copper, zinc that can also give a chemical contaminant. And then we have deodorizers, first aid products and any health and beauty products like hand lotions and hairsprays. They can also be chemical contaminants of food. And the way to prevent it, only use chemicals approved for food service. Purchase your chemicals from approved and reputable suppliers. And store chemicals away from food preparation areas. The chemicals must never be stored above food or food contact surfaces. And the use of the chemicals for their intended purpose, you need to follow the manufacturer's instructions. And lastly, we have physical contaminants. That's items that are in the food that should not be there. Things like metal shavings, staples, bandages, dirt, glass, things that are from the food that should have been taken out, like fish bones. More sources are jewellery and naturally occurring objects such as the seeds from fruit and bones. This is also why we have the rule in the kitchen that you don't use a rubber. If you make a mistake, you just score it out. And we don't use a sharpener to sharpen pencils because these things can get in the food. How does food become unsafe? Well, there's 4 things. One's called the time temperature abuse. The other is cross-contamination. The other is poor personal hygiene. And the last one is poor cleaning and sanitisation. And I will go into depth in all of those. So there's 5 common food handling mistakes. And this is needed for one of your activities later on. 5 risk factors for foodborne illness are purchasing food from unsafe sources. So say you purchased eggs from the local farmer and you did not know if those chickens were inoculated against salmonella or they didn't have a British Lion Standard stamp on them. Another run, it would be failing to cook food correctly or to the correct temperature. Or it could be that the food has been held at the incorrect temperature and it could be held holding it for too long. Or it could be the use of contaminated equipment, i.e. a knife used for chopping up raw meat and then used to cut the cake. Or it could be practicing poor personal hygiene. So poor personal hygiene can cause foodborne illnesses, that's food poisoning, when food handlers fail to wash their hands correctly after using the toilet, they cough or sneeze on the food, or they touch or scratch an open wound and then touch the food, or they go to work and work with food while they're sick. We could also store our food incorrectly. So you'll see on food labels, they'll tell you how to store it. It says keep refrigerated, that means you keep it in the fridge. It says keep frozen, that means keep it in the freezer. And if it's stored in a cool, dry place, that means you keep it in the cupboard, away from light and away from any moisture. Following the food packaging instructions will help prevent food from spoiling too quickly and reduce the risk of food poisoning, and will help to make sure that it tastes and looks at its best when it's eaten. If you're storing raw meat in the fridge, you should keep it in the bottom shelf of the fridge to avoid juices that contain bacteria dripping onto the ready-to-eat food. There is also shelf life details on prepackaged foods. So food can spoil quickly, i.e. they're highly perishable. That would be things like cooked meat and fish and dairy, and they will have a use by date. And if you keep it too long, these foods can cause food poisoning. So other foods that have a best before date, after that date the food may not be at its best in terms of flavour, colour and texture, and even though it may be safe to eat if they've been stored according to the instructions on the label. Time temperature abuse is when food has stayed too long at temperatures good for pathogens to grow, i.e. pathogens, food poisoning bacteria. Food that has been time temperature abused when it is not being held or stored at the correct temperatures, is not cooked or reheated enough to kill the pathogens, food poisoning bacteria, but it's not cooled correctly. The minimum temperature to keep food hot at is 63 degrees. You can keep it hotter at a higher temperature. The longest length of time that you can keep food hot for is 90 minutes. That's an hour and a half. To cook food to kill pathogens is above 75 degrees. And also, if you're cooling food, you cool it for below 5 degrees within 90 minutes. Cross-contamination is when pathogens, food poisoning bacteria, are transferred from one surface or food to another. Contaminated ingredients are added to food that receives no further cooking. That's cross-contamination. Ready-to-eat food touches contaminated surfaces. Ready-to-eat food requires no further cooking. So that could be a salad or it could be a cake. Food handlers touch contaminated food and then touch ready-to-eat food that requires no further cooking. And contaminated cleaning cloths can touch food contact surfaces. So that's what cross-contamination is. You'll see the picture there is cross-contamination. The green chopping board is used for vegetables and fruit, but in that picture the person is cutting raw meat on it. So poor cleaning and sanitisation is when equipment and utensils are not washed, rinsed and sanitised between uses. Food contact surfaces are wiped clean instead of washed, rinsed and sanitised, and wiping cloths are not stored in a sanitising solution between uses or washed, and sanitisation solution is not prepared correctly, i.e. there is instructions per manufacturers on how to prepare a sanitising solution. Food handlers should wash their hands before they start to work and after using the toilet. Should also wash their hands before and after handling raw meat, poultry and seafood. They should wash their hands after touching their face, hair or body. So if you put your hair back after washing your hands, you should be washing your hands afterwards. They should wash their hands after sneezing, coughing or using a tissue. They should wash their hands after eating, drinking, smoking, chewing gum. They should wash their hands after handling chemicals might affect the food safety. They should also wash their hands after taking out the rubbish, cleaning tables or dealing with the dirty dishes. They should wash their hands after touching clothing or aprons. Wash their hands after handling money. So they should wash their hands when they've left the kitchen and just after returning to the kitchen or the food preparation area. They should wash their hands after handling service animals or fish. And they should wash their hands after touching anything else that may contaminate their hands. The food handlers should keep their fingernails short and clean, should not wear false nails, and should not wear nail polish, gel or shellac. Now there's a myth about blue food gloves and handling of food. In practice, food handlers who wear the blue gloves generally forget about personal hygiene. The same personal hygiene principles apply to blue gloved hands as with ungloved hands. So gloved hands must be washed and changed regularly, especially after handling money, especially after handling raw meat, especially before handling high-risk foods. High-risk foods are foods that support bacterial growth, generally proteins, and they should be washed and changed regularly, especially if the nails are long, because the nails can poke holes into them and the bacteria from the hands can then get out of the glove and into the food. So a food handler should wear either a hat or another hair restraint. In our kitchens we wear bobbles if you've got long hair. Keep it back, away from the shoulders and away from the food. A top knot, anytime you bend over, will end up in the food, so your hair should be lower back at your nape of your neck into a bobble and then trapped into the hoop of your apron. Food handlers should wear clean clothing daily, so there's a clean apron every day. They should remove their aprons when they're leaving the food preparation areas, and they should remove jewellery from their hands and arms before prepping food or working around food preparation areas. A food handler must use a clean spoon every time they're tasting food, no double dipping. A food handler must not eat, drink, smoke or chew gum in the kitchen, and they should not be doing these whenever they're serving food, working in food preparations or working in areas used to clean utensils and equipment. Now, a food handler can contaminate food when they have a foodborne illness. They have food poisoning, or they have an open wound that contains a food poisoning bacteria or a pathogen. They can contaminate food if they sneeze or cough near the food. They have contact with a person who's sick, or if they touch anything that may contaminate their hands and don't wash their hands afterwards. And the food handler can contaminate food when they have symptoms such as diarrhea, vomiting, jaundice, that's a yellowing of the eyes or skin. Now, the food handler can contaminate food if they do any of these following actions: scratch their scalp, running their fingers through their hair, wiping or touching their nose, rubbing their ear, touching a pimple or an infected wound, wearing a dirty uniform, coughing or sneezing into their hand, spitting in the kitchen, or smoking in the kitchen.